All right, now, our first speaker is a nutritional superstar for those of us who care about such things, and we're so blessed to have her here. Felice Jacka, thank you. There's a bio in your program, so I'm not going to bore you and patronise you all by reading her bio because that's really dull. But she's a distinguished and highly regarded academic and has an OAM to her name. Long list of achievements which are available to you. I've listened to your book, Felice, Game Changer. I'm sorry I haven't read it. Some authors think that's incredibly rude when you don't read their book. But anyway, I just loved it. I found it absolutely fascinating. So it's a hard recommend. And I haven't read your book, There's a Zoo in My Poo, but the title is so good that I plan to. And I think it probably should be in every bookcase in every home. So I'm a huge fan of your work, partly because your pioneering work provides the critical game-changing evidence to prove something that we all know from our work, which is that food is prevention and cure. So without further ado, please welcome Felice Jacka.
Thank you so much, Laura. And, can I just say, I am blessed enough to talk at really fancy conferences with thousands of people in Milan and Vienna and all over the world. And I'm more excited about this conference than any of those. I feel like I've sort of come into my tribe, which is just so exciting and really what a beautiful feeling and what a beautiful environment. And Matthew said that the speakers are not getting paid very much. Well, I'm not getting paid at all. I would pay to come here. This is just great. Now, I don't want to sort of stand up here and just talk at you and talk statistics for half an hour or so. What I'm going to do is try and talk about this in a way that everyone understands and responds to, but just leave plenty of time for questions at the end, because that's where I find people get the most benefit. People may be wondering what it is that I'm doing here at a sort of soil farming conference. I think the reason that I'm here will become blindingly obvious towards the end, but it is a bit of a journey. So I hope you'll bear with me. Some of you might be thinking, what on earth is nutritional psychiatry? So nutritional psychiatry is research that seeks to understand how diet and nutrition influence our mental and brain health right across the life course. And then it's the application of that into clinical practice, hopefully into policy, and with a focus on prevention as well as treatment. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a very, very unconventional family. My father, some of you may even have heard of him, Jacka. He was the sort of founder of naturopathy in Australia. And lovely man, born in 1920, had some very non-evidence-based ideas, and sometimes I think it's a wonder I survived my childhood. Vaccines give you autism and you don't ever have antibiotics, which I'm actually very, very glad about now. But what it meant was that the paradigm in which I grew up was that food is really important and it's the fundamental of health. Now, I know that it's so much more than that. And, for me, there'll be a lot of... I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. But it sort of meant that I had an intrinsic, really great interest in food from a very, very young age. And it wasn't just food for the taste. It was the ethics of food, the environmental impact of food, and this is way back in the 70s, and that sort of stayed with me. Now, my first degree was in fine art, and I then made my way into psychology and an undergrad in psychology in my 30s. And as I'm going through my training in psychology, I'm thinking, this is, I don't really have an interest in being a counsellor. Very interested in the brain, though, very interested in statistics and learning about research. So I made my way through all sorts of odd circumstances into a newly established psychiatric research unit down at Geelong. And coming into that and coming into psychiatry research, I was really gobsmacked to realise that unlike the rest of medicine, cardiology or diabetes or cancer or whatever, there was no recognition, no discussion, no research on how diet was relevant to mental and brain health. The paradigm of psychiatry was very Cartesian. Everything above the neck mattered. Nothing below the neck was of any relevance. It was all about neurons and, synapses and things like this. Now, we were starting to glean that there was so much more, and that in particular our immune system was very closely involved with mental and brain health. And then, things like the stress response system. And then there was this new emerging understanding that there was this part of our brain called the hippocampus that grew and shrunk over our life course. And this was very important for mental health, very important for learning and memory. And the emerging animal research was showing that you could really influence this by diet. So I thought, gee, why is there no research on this? Why, there were a few little studies about this supplement, which is not the same as food. I just put out there very clearly, if people ate more folate, but our diet is so complex. It's so much more than that. So I proposed doing my PhD looking at diet, the whole of diet, and how it might relate to clinical anxiety and depressive disorders and bipolar disorder in this big population-based sample of women. And everyone thought I was a bit bonkers, really, and there was a lot of sort of eye-rolling and almost head-patting, particularly from the older psychiatrists. But I proceeded to do this and, of course, showed what everybody just knows instinctively, that people who had healthier diets, even when we took into account their socioeconomic status, income, education, body weight, other health conditions, other health behaviours, the quality of people's diets was very closely linked to their mental health. And this study was considered so groundbreaking in psychiatry that it was published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry. It was all over the news. It was voted the most important paper of psychiatry in 2010. And I'm thinking, really? Surely this is kind of bleedingly obvious. But for psychiatry, which had all been about pharmaceuticals and synapses and brains, this was kind of revolutionary. It was a different way of thinking about it. Now, that publication then opened the door for me, because what we found was that right across the world, in so many different settings, there were researchers who had these big epidemiological studies. So epidemiology, or observational research, is when you have lots and lots of information from surveys, questionnaires, and you use statistics to put them together. So it's not an experiment, it's just using data that are collected from hopefully representative members of the population and using statistics to test hypotheses. So there were many, many studies around the world that have collected lots and lots of data on diet, on mental health, on all those other factors that you need to take into account, like socioeconomic factors and all of those things. But they'd never sort of thought to put them together. So I was able to go around the world and collaborate with all these wonderful groups, and in that way really advance this whole platform of evidence very quickly, because we didn't have to spend years and years and years going out and asking people questions. The data were already collected. And so in doing this, I was able to establish that diet and nutrition and the quality of people's diets was intrinsically linked to their risk, their prevalence of, like the presence of, or the risk for what we call common mental disorders. And this was true across the world, and it was true right across the age range. Now, just stepping back a bit and putting this into a larger context, we know from the largest health studies in the world that our Western industrialised food system and poor diet, via its direct impact plus its impact on chronic disease, is the leading cause of illness and early death. Now, mental disorders are an enduring, high prevalence issue. They account for a huge burden of disease right across the world. They're usually in the top 5, top 10 causes of disease burden. Their prevalence has remained pretty stable over as long as we've been measuring it, except until recently, where we've seen, particularly in young people, a really big increase. Now, of course, COVID's had something to do with that, but it actually was before that. And of course, there's also things such as ADHD and autism spectrum disorder and these neurodevelopmental conditions that seem to be on the uptick as well, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. But in that sense, nutritional psychiatry brings together two of the leading causes of disease burden and looks at how they interact. Now, why is this important? Because so many of the risk factors for mental disorders are things that are very difficult for us to control. They're things like our genetics, early life trauma, life stress, poverty and disadvantage. These things can all give rise to mental disorders, particularly common mental disorders like depression and anxiety. They're hard to modify. So finding factors that actually are modifiable then is really important when we want to think about prevention. Food and what we put in our mouth several times a day is obviously modifiable, but there's a massive caveat about this. This should not be about individual responsibility. Some on the right, of course, would love to say, "Oh, well, you're really depressed. You've been eating too much pizza, haven't you? You know, this is your fault." A bit like cancer. You know, you haven't been exercising around. It's not about that. It's about this environment that we're in and about the food system. So zooming back in, I did this study in the American Journal of Psychiatry. It was in a big population-based, very representative sample of Australian women. But then I went to Norway and I worked with the mother and baby cohort study, which is massive. It's like over 100,000 women who were enrolled during their pregnancy and being followed. And we had data from more than 30,000 mothers and their children. I looked at mothers' diets during pregnancy and I looked at children's diets through the first few years, taking into account all of those other factors that we need to consider. And I looked at the trajectory of children's emotional health over those first 5 years and saw very clearly that both mums' diets and children's diets were independently related to that trajectory. Then I was able to go and work with different groups in Australia, but also in the UK, in Barts and the London School of Medicine, and look at this in adolescence, because half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. If we want to think about prevention, we need to be thinking young. And again, I saw that young people, adolescents, primary age of onset around puberty, there was a very clear dose-response relationship between the quality of their diets and their mental health, independent of family factors, poor family management, family chaos, all of these other things. We saw it even in young people in East London and the Tower Hamlets, very, very disadvantaged part of London. And we saw, even in the face of, drug use and cigarettes and all of those things, alcohol, that young people who ate more vegetables at home were more protected, basically. Now, what we see in these studies over and over again, I think this is really important, is that there's two distinct factors. They're not just the opposite of each other. One is the good stuff, the sort of stuff that's growing out here and that Keely's developing in the beautiful garden. And then there's the industrial foods, the junk foods, the processed foods. Young people in Australia eat 7 serves of junk food a day on average. 7 serves. Less than 4% get the minimum recommended vegetable intake. Less than 1% of toddlers get enough of these vegetables. Not having enough of the good stuff is independently linked to emotional behavioural health. Getting too much of the bad stuff is independently linked. They don't just counteract each other. They're quite independent of each other. Both things are important. And if you think, lots of young people at home are getting good food. Parents are trying to get them to eat their veggies and eat their whole grains and all the rest of it. But then they're going and having before school, during school, after school, thick shakes and fried foods and this, that and the other, chips, ice creams. That's still really problematic. And the opposite is also true. A lot of older people are not necessarily going out to Macca's or Kentucky Fried or what have you, but they're not having a diverse diet. They're not getting those foods that we know and are starting to understand are so critically important, the vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices. So both things are problematic. And then looking at the other end of life. As people age and their brain ages and circumstances get more challenging, people often develop depression for the first time. And we saw again that the quality of diet was linked to the risk for developing depression for the first time in older age. So all these studies now have been done around the world, not just by me obviously, by many, many others. And we know that the quality of people's diets, whether they're in Norway or Brazil or China or India or anywhere, is linked to their risk for developing depression and anxiety. And it looks like people who have healthier diets, diets that are more traditional in flavour, more whole foods, less of the junk foods, that they are protected about 30-35% lower risk of developing these mental disorders independent of all those other factors. So that's great, but you would have heard the term correlation doesn't equal causation. So we can't say for sure that diet causes or protects, so we need experiments. So I was mad enough in the first year of my postdoc to try and get funding for a trial, a randomised controlled trial. And the second time I was actually able to do this. This is back in the days when we had really good research funding in Australia that sort of dried up for 10 years and it's only just starting to come back now. And so I put together the protocol for the SMILES trial. Now, some of you might have heard about this because it's actually a very famous trial now because it was the first trial that sought to answer that question. Well, if I took someone who had a quite serious mental disorder, help them to improve the quality of their diet, would it actually have an impact on their mental health? And of course, no one thought it would. I couldn't recruit. It took like 3 years, I think, to recruit 67 people, but I recruited people with moderate to severe major depressive disorder. Now, so many of these people had been sick for so long because whilst things like antidepressants and psychotherapy are really helpful for a lot of people, there's about half of people who don't really respond to them or they only respond, marginally. So the group that we recruited, there were many, many people who'd been sick for a very long time. Most were on other forms of treatment, but they were still really suffering a lot. Anyone here who's experienced major depression will know you would rather have your legs cut off. I experienced this when I was young, which is why I was very interested in pursuing psychology and mental health. It's the worst. So many of these people lying on the couch, drinking coffee, wine and cigarettes, that was it, just so impaired. So they were randomly assigned to get either social support, which we already knew was really helpful for people with major depression, or dietary support from a dietitian. And all that was gradually reducing the junk food and increasing the veggies, increasing the legumes, extra virgin olive oil. That's like gold, it's medicine. Fish, good quality whole red meat, not processed. Really just doing those fundamental things to improve their diet. But a big part of what we saw was a very big reduction in their sweets and fried foods and junk foods. And at the end of the 3 months, I did not think that we'd see anything. I was just as sceptical of my hypothesis as anyone else was. And believe me, there was a lot of people who were very sceptical. And I also thought we didn't have enough people to see a difference. But when we analysed the data, we nearly fell off our chairs because the people who got the dietary support had a major reduction in their depressive symptoms. And that reduction correlated very tightly with the degree to which they improved their diet. The more that they improved it, the better off they were. Now, this trial was headline around the world because, again, psychiatry, they were, what vegetables? Now, be very clear. If you've got something very serious, major depression, you can't fix it by just eating a salad. It's definitely not that simple. But it does suggest that dietary support to make those changes, and we made this super simple for people, very affordable, very easy. In fact, we did a really detailed cost analysis of the diet that people were eating when they came into the study and then the diet that we were advocating. Our diet was cheaper because we were saying, look, frozen vegetables, fabulous. Use tinned fish, use, tinned legumes, dried legumes. They're cheap. Make it really easy and simple, and they did. Now, we heard from so many people afterwards that had just been life-changing for them. One woman who's been on the tally with me and everything, she said, you know, she was just, for years, just didn't have a life, was just not eating, was just absolutely almost bedbound. And she got up off the couch and she started walking, and then she joined a hiking group, and then she gave up smoking, and then she stopped drinking alcohol, and then she, like, these are gateway behaviours. You change one thing like exercise or diet, and then you start to feel better and you start to sleep better, and then you start to be able to make those changes. So that was very cool. Still a lot of scepticism, but it's reducing. You know, I'm starting to speak at conferences and finding full rooms and people actually starting to listen, especially the younger psychiatrists and doctors. So since then, there's been another few studies that have done the same thing and shown the same thing. We definitely need more research, but all of the evidence is pointing very strongly towards this. And of course, the animal studies where you do experiments and you can actually manipulate things and understand things in more detail are also supporting all of this. But then the question became, well, okay, so how is this working? How is it that diet influences mental and brain health? And so then we turned our attention to the mechanisms. So there's all of these factors that diet strongly influences that we now know are really linked to our mental and brain health. So the first one is the immune system. I think everyone in this room would have heard of the concept of inflammation. So when we are injured or we're ill, our immune system bursts into action and releases all of these many very complex molecules that help us to get better or to heal an injury. But there's many factors in our modern environment that mean that our immune system is on low-grade alert all the time. And those molecules that are floating around as a result actually do damage when they're just chronic rather than acute. That's inflammation. It really underpins virtually every chronic disease, you know, cancer, cardiometabolic, heart health, everything. So the fact that diet is a major modifier of the immune system is really important. Diet affects how our genes are turned on and off. It affects the function of the mitochondria in our cells. It affects our brain plasticity, that key part of the brain that we know is so important in learning and memory, but also in mental health. So the hippocampus, this little tiny two little things in the middle of our brain. I also was able to lead the first study that showed, same as what we saw in the animal studies, that in older people, there was a very, very clear dose-response relationship between the quality of the diet that they eat and the size of their hippocampus. And this wasn't a trivial effect. This was really big because as we age, our hippocampus shrinks and then we start to forget things and forget our kids' names and lose our keys and all the rest of it. People who had healthier diets had much bigger hippocampi. Now, that also has been replicated in many other studies. So we were starting to get a sense of all the different ways in which diet might affect our mental health, the way our neurotransmitters are produced. What else? Our stress response system, which is very much this gut-brain axis. And this is where we get to the crunch. Our microbiome, our gut microbiome in particular. So it's only in the last really 10 years or so that we've really started to understand about the microbes that live in us and on us. There's trillions of them. We didn't really know about them, you know, up until, I don't know, the turn of the 2000s. We thought the germs were bad. That was about it, because we couldn't sequence the DNA of these and identify them and start to understand what they might be doing. And I hasten to add that we're still at the very early stages of this. But once that technology was developed, we started to recognise that, man, we are just covered in these things. You know, our skin and up our nose and our mouth and our lungs. And of course, the gut is the largest reservoir of these microbes. It's not just bacteria, there's viruses, there's fungi, archaea, all these other microbes working synergistically. We started to be able to sequence some of these. We've just now got the technology to start sequencing viruses as well as bacteria, but we're moving also into the fungi. And the emerging evidence from little bits of research, because there's a lot of people looking at this around the world, unlike nutritional psychiatry, where I was just like this lone wolf battling away for years and years and years, the microbes are a major focus of interest, which is brilliant. And there's a lot of money going into research in this area in the US. Not in Australia, there's none, but in the US there is. And the microbes that live in your gut, they have their primary role really is to break down the bits of food that our human enzymes can't break down. So that's primarily fibre, complex carbohydrates from plant foods. Lots of different types of fibre. So vegetables and fruits, yeah, sure. Whole grains, all the different sorts of whole grains. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, these sorts of things. Nuts and seeds, herbs and spices. Because it's not just the fibre, it's the phytochemicals. So we're starting to understand that polyphenols are really important food for the bugs in your gut. That's the easiest way of thinking about it. And what they do is when they break down these compounds, they do it through a process of fermentation. And that releases thousands of different molecules. Like this process can produce neurotransmitters. It's very important in our immune function. Indeed, 70% of our immune cells are in the gut. And the microbes break down these food products to produce the molecules that influence those. They influence our metabolism and body weight. They influence, obviously, our immune system, but our brain plasticity, the strength of our vascular system. There's many things. They influence the way our genes express themselves. Obviously, they have a big impact on the stress response system because that's our gut and our brain talking to each other. So they're incredibly important, and one of the most important factors that influences their function and their composition is the food that we eat every day. Now, the bare minimum of fibre that we're supposed to be having a day is about 25 grams for women, about 30 for men. Almost nobody reaches that these days. Back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers, we used to get maybe as many as 100 grams a day from all different sources. And then, of course, there's the phytochemicals that we're only just starting to find out about. So many of you will have heard of polyphenols, otherwise known to many as antioxidants, the sorts of things you get in colourful fruits and vegetables and green tea and black tea. And these we're increasingly understanding are really important to health, but we only know about 10,000 of them. There may be as many as 150,000 different types of phytochemicals in plant foods. But the plant foods need to have been grown in soil with microbes. And this is the kicker. The environmental microbes, environmental biodiversity, is closely linked to human biodiversity. Now, Craig Liddicote's going to be talking about this, I think, today, and Craig and I are just starting to work out how we can collaborate together with his team. Dan is going to be talking about this later, and I cannot wait. I'm here really to listen to Dan and to find out what he's got to say. And hopefully he and I are going to be working together as well. But when we step back again to look at the whole food system, that industrialised food system, with whether it's retail, whether it's agriculture, whether it's health, everything that makes up the food system, the UN Food Summit in 2022 estimated, and I hasten to say this is a very back-of-the-envelope calculation, they couldn't input into the models so many factors that we know are critical, including the loss of soil and microbiota and biodiversity in soil, or the impact on farmers, or any of these other things. But even with what they did have to work with, they estimated that the cost to the planet of our industrialised food system is roughly $20 trillion a year. Now, the whole GDP of China is about 16 trillion a year. Now, roughly 11 trillion of that is the impact on human health because of industrial foods and their lack of goodness and their excessive badness. And then most of the rest of it is the impact on the environment, because the industrialised food system is the leading cause of biodiversity loss. And again, that biodiversity in the environment is directly linked to us. We know that our biodiversity, particularly the microbes in our gut, running our immune system, are being lost. Keystone species are being lost. If you think about diversity as a marker of health, it's a bit, the analogy is like a rainforest. A rainforest has a multitude of plants and insects and fungi and everything working together synergistically, and it's very robust and resilient. Whereas if you have a monoculture, it's very vulnerable to just like one parasite or something coming in and just wiping it out. Our microbes in the gut are like this. What we understand now is that the microbes in the gut not only train an infant's immune system in those first few days, weeks, months of life, but mum's microbes during pregnancy are really key to that as well. But they also seem to influence brain development. So now what we're seeing is that the diet of mothers during pregnancy and the health of their microbes is directly linked to things like neurodevelopment, cognitive ability, things that relate to ADHD and autism. I did more research with that big group in Norway, and we showed that there was a direct relationship between the quality of mum's diets, again, how much healthy food they had, how much ultra-processed food they had, and then the children's diets and their likelihood of having ADHD. We know that these things are really increasing, and people in our field, we can't demonstrate it for sure yet, but it won't be long, is related back to this loss of microbes in our guts, this loss of biodiversity. And of course, we're losing biodiversity rapidly, and the soil is critical, and that's why I'm here. Now, we're doing all sorts of great stuff at the Food and Mood Centre. We're developing and have just started a big trial where we've spent years developing an app that's designed to help pregnant women to improve their diet, and then we want to see whether that has an impact on the neuro and cognitive outcomes of the children. But my real interest is in getting policy change and getting things changed. Now, happily, I've been really successful in getting Psychiatry to listen, such that the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry now lists what is essentially lifestyle medicine as the foundation of treatment for mood disorders. So in the guidelines it says, before you do anything else, you've got to talk about diet and exercise or movement and sleep and smoking cessation. Psychiatrists don't know how to do this. You'll see all sorts of psychiatrists in the media, particularly the Americans, who are just like, oh yeah, I know everything about diet. And they will have had about 2 hours of training through all of their years and years and years of medical. It's like you might as well ask your hairdresser. But no, they're the experts. So anyway, one of the things I did when I founded the Food and Mood Centre in 2017, and now we're a group of about 50 and we're doing all sorts of fantastic studies, is we set up the Food and Mood Academy. Now, the first thing we produced was a free online course on food and mood that any of you can go and do. That has thus far enrolled nearly 90,000 people from more than 160 countries around the world. It's one of the most popular courses in the world because we need to combat the misinformation that many are promoting, and we want people to know about this so that they can take control themselves. We've more recently worked with the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists to develop accredited training for psychiatrists and psychologists in nutritional psychiatry, so they understand what the evidence is, what it isn't, but really importantly, how to apply it. And more recently, we've worked with the Royal College of General Practitioners in Australia to develop training on lifestyle medicine, more broadly than nutrition. So we're having an impact on clinical practice, which is great. The work I've led has been cited in more than, I think, 130 high-level policy documents now. The World Health Organization in its mental health report now lists unhealthy diet as a risk factor for mental disorders. This is amazing. All of these, the UN all citing our work. Fabulous. How exciting. Has it resulted in any policy change? No, not one little bit, because, of course, you're up against the biggest industries in the world. Big agriculture, big food. So getting policy change has to come from a groundswell of people. It's only when people understand this that they make changes, they ask for changes, they buy differently. And then politicians pay attention, and then policymakers pay attention. It will not happen without that. And that's why I'm so passionate about bringing health into the conversation about agriculture and soil. If you think about the way governments are set up, you'll have the Department of Agriculture and Industry. Food is a commodity. You'll have the Department of Welfare. Oh, people don't have enough to eat. We need to give them something. You have health, the Department of Health. You have education and training. None of them are talking to each other. We need a ministry for food that's across all of this. And we need to be thinking about food differently. Food is not just something we put in our mouth to get calories. It's the foundation of culture. It's the foundation of equity. It's the foundation of climate and the environment. It's the foundation of joy. It's the foundation of health. And we need to be coming at it from a much more holistic point of view, and that comes from educating and galvanising people to do differently. Now, one thing I know is that when we talk about food in the public health space, for 20 years, when we talk about food, what do we talk about? We talk about fat. We talk about obesity, body size. What a stupid thing to focus on. It's very difficult to modify body size. You've got genetics, you're living in an environment that promotes the consumption of these foods that are designed to interact with the reward systems of your brain. We know they make people overeat. We know that they really promote the deposition of body fat. How do people push back against this when every time they go to the supermarket or they go to fill up their car with petrol or anywhere, they're bombarded when kids have these foods promoted to them through their sporting clubs and online and on the television with no regulation, no restrictions. People can't change their body size. They turn off. They give up. It's stigmatising and they just go, I can't lose weight. I'm just going to eat the chips. But if you let people know, and we see this from the research where we've even young tradies who have like the worst diets, male tradies, my colleagues got them to change their diets quite radically and showed a massive improvement in their mental health because they understood that this was more immediate. It's not something that might happen off in the future where they might have a heart attack. Right now, this week, your mood, your mental health, your brain health is affected by what you put in your gob. And for people with children, grandchildren, then they pay attention. Oh, I'm really worried about mental health problems in my adolescent. Okay, diet. Oh, that's important. I'll think about that. Talking about things from a different point of view galvanises action. I've been fortunate enough to be one of only 2 researchers in the world on the steering committee for the World Economic Forum's New Frontiers and Nutrition Initiative. Everybody else on that steering committee is from Unilever or Nestle or PepsiCo. And the other researcher, who's a brilliant nutrition researcher, he's American, so his whole focus is on obesity and metabolic disease. When I got onto that steering committee, I was able to move the whole conversation to mental and brain health, gut health, soil health, making those links. And that gets interest because policymakers have been hearing obesity forever and they go, God, we've put calorie counts on our food and we've done this, that and the other, and nothing's changed. People are just getting larger and sicker. Well, actually, you're sort of focusing on the wrong thing. So this is why I want to bring health into the conversation about soil and about agriculture. But it's too easy for people and governments to just ignore, oh, that's hippie stuff off in the corner. I don't care about soil. But if you make it about self-interest, this is about how you and your brain is going to age. It's about you and your kids and how well they're going to do at school and how well they're going to manage this really complex, difficult world. Then they start to pay attention. So I'm just going to leave you with a few ideas that I have about just some simple things that we might do that might have an impact. So I've already told you about how appalling the diets of young people are. I'm working with Farm My School. Has anyone here heard of Farm My School? So this is a pilot project at a farm, at a school very close to where I live, and beautiful James and Ben, who are the incredible dedicated farmers who did this. No money, just absolute hard work and passion. Met Wayne, who's the wonderful principal at Bellarine Secondary College, And they had a great big field that really wasn't being used. It was a soccer pitch, but no one was really playing soccer. This is a school with about 1,000 kids. Let's turn it into a regenerative farm. Let's get the kids working on the farm and learning about soil science and learning about food, and then maybe even eating the food. So a couple of years ago, the whole community came together for 2 or 3 days. Costa came down from Sydney. We had this big festival, and that whole farm was built by the community in a couple of days. It was just amazing. What we want to see, what I've been talking to politicians about, is the possibility of this being scaled up. Imagine if every school in Australia that had land was able to turn it into a regenerative farm, and that the students would all then learn about food and soil. But even more than that, imagine if that produce went to a hot school lunch. At least one meal a day then for all of these children and adolescents who are not getting any of the stuff that they need to grow and to produce the molecules that do all the work in their body. They'd be getting, a whole great meal every day, and hopefully retraining their palates and learning about food. Do you know at Ballerine there's about 1,000 kids? They have access to a heavily subsidised box of beautiful vegetables from the farm, and yet one family in that whole school purchases that produce. One family. Now, this is the issue. It's never been about the availability of decent food in Australia. We're very lucky. It's about the influence of marketing, the retail food environment, where people think, oh, what am I going to eat tonight? I know, I'll just go to the supermarket and grab this stuff wrapped in cling wrap that's been irradiated, kept in cold storage, has no microbes, has very low nutrient value. What the hell is this thing, this kohlrabi? Well, I don't even know what that is. What does it take? What do I do with it? What are these veggies? I don't know what to do with them. And the kids are going, oh, I'm not eating that. Because they're not used to it, because we've got 2 or 3 generations now of kids who've not been exposed to food or know how to cook. If we could scale up Farm My School and have a school lunch program across Australia, that would be a really great start. But then I think we need to be looking at our planning laws and how land is made available and the housing developments, and let's do that differently so that every community has access to a farm. And let's make food much more available to people so that we can cut out those big retail supermarkets altogether. Now, there's so much more that I'd love to say, and I'm certainly going to be around for the next 2 days. I'm so excited. We've got time now for lots of questions. And fantastic. Yes, and please ask anything. I'm the queen of the stupid questions. There's so much I don't know. The more I learn, the more I just go, oh my God, I just don't know anything. Okay, you were first, I think. Yeah. Can we extrapolate that out to all mental health, so ADHD? Yeah, it's a really good question. So is it just about depression and anxiety, or is it broader than that? I think it's a great question. We don't know yet about things such as schizophrenia and psychosis, but we're going to find out. There are people starting to work on this, and it makes sense to me because if our microbes, the microbes of mum during development, the microbes in those first few days, weeks of months of life, are programming not just our immune system but also our brain development, and those microbes are really insufficient. They're not diverse. They're like a desert in mum. The kids are getting exposed to antibiotics within seconds of being born, often because of caesareans, and then in the first year of life, antibiotics. In many countries, antibiotics all the way through the food chain. More than 80% of antibiotics, I mean, many of you will know this, use in the world are in the food chain, wiping out our microbes, going into the wastewater, promoting genetic resistance to antibiotics. So we think because something like schizophrenia and certainly things like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, they're developmental disorders. They happen during pregnancy and in early life. We think the microbes are very closely involved. The research evidence is just starting to show that. One of the studies that one of my team has been involved in, big cohort of Australian women and their infants followed, and they're seeing very high rates of autism spectrum disorder, up over 10%. clinically assessed. This is not just, people self-selecting and saying, oh, I have autism. Properly assessed. And it looks like the mother's diet is closely tied to it. So the quality of mothers' diets is linked through their immune system, and that was really what was measured, their immune system, to whether or not the children had cognitive delay, and learning difficulties, things like this. But upstream, it was the socioeconomic status of the mother that seemed to be pushing the diet one way and then relating. So we know that there's a link between socioeconomic status and neurodevelopmental conditions look like working through, at least in part, mothers' diets. So we hazard a pretty good guess that things like psychosis are also related. We know in people with psychosis, they metabolize lipids differently, they metabolize fats differently, they metabolize sugars differently. They often have more food sensitivities to things like dairy and like casein and gluten because their immune system isn't quite right. So we think that this is where it's coming from, but we need a lot more research and a lot of time to figure this out. Happily, that research is happening. But right now, as I was saying to Dan last night, the microbiome, diet, the brain, they are the most complex things we know of. We're only just starting to get the computer power to understand these things and how they all interact. They need very, very, very hard sums, quantum computing, lots of microscopes, lots of clever brains. But what you need to do to make sure that you've got a healthy microbiome is actually pretty simple. And it's around where do you source your food, what sort of foods you're eating, fermented foods. Very interested in fermented foods. We've just done a study where it looks like they affect that hippocampus and the connectivity with the frontal lobe of the brain. We need to do a lot more work. But fermentation, you have kombucha. Those microbes, when they're in your gut, fermenting the substrates and producing those molecules, they do that in a bottle or in a jar. And humans have been consuming fermented foods forever, up until recently. So we're very interested in fermented foods and doing a lot more work there. So I always say, look, more of the good stuff, less of the bad stuff, throw in some fermented foods. Like, that's actually pretty simple. Yeah. I don't know who to pick first. I think you were next.
Thank you so much. I'm just curious to know, in your initial study, you talked about choosing a cohort of women. I'm curious to know why you chose women, knowing that we're so under-researched.
Yeah, that's actually, so the question is, why did I, in my first PhD study, just focus on women? Now, it was really just about the availability of the data. The research centre that I was working within had this big population-based study of women underway. They only started to do the male sample after I did my PhD. But the fact that women are so under-researched in medical science is top of mind for so many of the research projects we do. And it's a really important point. But it was just basically a matter of availability of data. And many of the other studies I've done have been both, both sexes, both genders. I don't know who was next, so I'm just going to pick you.
Thanks. The nutrient density of food, do you think that the policymakers are understanding that enough to start putting that onto food? What nutrients?
Oh, not even vaguely. Like, they don't think about food at all. I mean, the Obesity Policy Coalition, which is now, thankfully, they've renamed themselves, but they're a big public health agency in Australia, and I work closely with them. And they came out a few years ago with a big, set of, I think, 6 policy recommendations, and one of them is very strongly evidence-based, which is to put a little tinsy-wincy tax on sugar-sweetened beverages because they're a major source of added sugars in the Australian diet. Within minutes, Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten, both leaders came rushing out the door going, oh, no, please, sugar growers, cane growers, no, we're not going to do it. It's all right. No, we're not going to do that. It's down to personal responsibility. Now, that's coming directly from industry. It's your responsibility. Stop drinking those drinks. They're not good for you. Oh, but they can be part of a balanced diet. So policymakers don't even think about the big obvious things, let alone the actual quality of the food that's available to us. And I actually think that we need to get over the fact that less than 4% of Australians consume even the basic number of vegetables before we even talk about the quality of those vegetables. But obviously, that is something that I'm very interested in and I think is critically important. And it may be a way of getting this message across. You know, the research we've done has been on the front cover of Time magazine, Oprah magazine, New York Times, all of these things, because people are like, what? What I eat is related to my mental health. So people get it. Politicians are very slow to change, and this is why we have not yet seen any policy changes in relation to this evidence base. Yeah, okay. Oh, my goodness. I think you've been...
Maybe over some fermented grapes later in the day.
Oh, please.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
You know, in a funny way, and some of my friends have been appalled at me saying this, like he's a mad anti-vaxxer, he doesn't care about evidence at all, but he is very, very interested in big food and the food industry and everything else, and you never know, along with the bad might come some good. We can only hope. And the world is a very complex place, good and bad everywhere, and often things change in a very lumpy, 3 steps forward, 45 steps backwards and all over the shop. But it's that butterfly effect. It's also, is it the 100th monkey, where just suddenly there's a critical groundswell. So we can only hope, and I'm here to support regenerative, wonderful farming in Australia and doing whatever I can to support organisations like Soils for Life and anyone else I can support, because this is my future. I've got my daughter Ivy here. If you see her tall, wonderful thing wandering around, she's going to have children. My other daughter's going to have children. We're not going to have a planet. This is the crux. This generation, like if we don't do something, really we're fucked. Let's face it. So, oh, Laura!